A nameless blacksmith dragged a dead lion through the castle gates, covered in blood and carrying secrets darker than the beast he'd slain. He should have claimed his prize, the king's daughter and a fortune in gold. Instead, he knelt before the throne and spoke words that would shatter a kingdom built on 23 years of lies. His request was so shocking, so impossible, that the queen collapsed and the king's face turned to stone. What could make a peasant warrior risk execution to demand the one thing no man should ever ask for? What truth was buried so deep that an entire castle trembled when he finally spoke it aloud? This is the story of a son who was thrown away like garbage, a mother who mourned a child she believed was dead, and a king who discovered that the crown on his head was built on bones he never knew existed. It's about the moment when a single question, "Who am I?" became more dangerous than any sword. And when the answer came, it set fire to everything power had tried to keep hidden. Some truths are worth dying for. Some loves transcend death itself. And some choices once made can never be undone. But here's what no one expected. The warrior who killed the lion didn't do it for glory. He did it for revenge against a secret so terrible that even the beast itself was a witness to the crime. And when he finally stood face to face with the woman whose existence had haunted his dreams, when he looked into her eyes and saw his own face reflected back, the only words he could speak were, "You owe me the life I never had." The lion's roar shattered the dawn silence over Arvindal, a sound so primal it seemed to claw at the very stones of the castle walls. Chaol emerged from the mist-shrouded forest, dragging the massive carcass behind him, his leather armor torn and drenched in blood, some of it the beast's, most of it his own. The crowd that had gathered at the gates fell silent, their celebration dying in their throats as they took in the warrior's face. There was no triumph there, no joy of victory, only something dark and hollow, like a man who had killed not for glory, but to answer a question that had haunted him since birth. His hands trembled as he released the rope, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes flickered toward the castle tower with an expression that made several onlookers step back. It was the look of a man who had come not to claim a reward, but to collect a debt. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the morning dew created a nauseating perfume that hung thick in the air. King Aldrich descended the stone steps slowly, each footfall echoing like a judge's hammer, his crimson cloak dragging behind him like a river of authority. His face was a mask of calculated generosity, but those close enough could see the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, an almost imperceptible sign of discomfort. When he spoke, his voice boomed across the courtyard with rehearsed majesty. "The man who has freed my people from this scourge shall have my daughter's hand in marriage, and with it, lands and title befitting a hero of the realm." The crowd erupted in cheers. Bells began their frantic celebration, and Princess Alara appeared at the balcony, pale as moonlight, her delicate hands gripping the stone rail until her knuckles whitened. She looked down at Chaol with eyes that held neither joy nor protest, only a resigned acceptance of her fate as a prize to be claimed. Yet something was wrong. Chaol stood motionless, his gaze fixed not on the beautiful princess above, but on the figure standing in shadow behind the king, Queen Isolde, whose face had drained of all color the moment the warrior had emerged from the forest. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the very air had turned to stone. Servants stopped mid-motion. Guards' hands moved instinctively toward their sword hilts, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Chaol spoke, his voice quiet but carrying across the courtyard with devastating clarity. "Your Majesty, I do not wish for the princess." He paused, letting the words sink in like poison into water. "I wish for the queen." The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. A lady-in-waiting's goblet shattered against the cobblestones. A guard's lance clattered to the ground. Princess Alara's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. But it was King Aldrich's reaction that sent a chill through every witness. His face transformed from benevolent monarch to something feral and dangerous, the carefully constructed mask of civility cracking like thin ice. Queen Isolde swayed on her feet, one hand pressed to her chest as if to keep her heart from bursting through her ribs, the other reaching out to steady herself against a column. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged, only a silent, terrible recognition. Chaol knelt, but there was nothing supplicant about the gesture. It was a challenge, a deliberate provocation, his blood-stained hands spread wide, as if offering himself for judgment. The weight of his gaze remained locked on the queen, and in that moment, several courtiers noticed something that made their breath catch. The warrior's eyes held not lust or ambition, but something far more dangerous. Purpose. "Explain yourself!" King Aldric's roar shook the very foundations of the castle, his hand instinctively moving to the sword at his hip. His face had gone from pale to crimson, veins pulsing visibly at his temples. "Speak, peasant, before I have your tongue torn from your insolent mouth." But Chaol's attention never wavered from Queen Isolde, who now trembled so violently that her elaborate headdress slipped, revealing hair streaked with silver that aged her beyond her years. Her emerald eyes, those legendary eyes that poets had written verses about, were wide with an emotion that transcended mere shock. It was recognition. It was terror. It was something that looked disturbingly like grief. "My request is just," Chaol said, his voice steady despite the dozen weapons now pointed at his chest. Not born of desire or ambition, but of truth long buried. The crowd erupted in confused murmurs, nobles whispering frantically to one another, trying to decode the meaning behind such madness. Was this man deranged? Was this some elaborate plot? But those watching the queen saw the truth written in her body's betrayal, the way she stepped backward as if physically struck, the way her hands shook as she raised them to her face, the way tears began to stream down her cheeks without her seeming to notice. The king advanced on Chaol, his hand now fully gripping his sword hilt, knuckles white with rage. "You dare insult my wife, my crown, my—" But his words died as Chaol finally looked away from the queen and met the king's eyes with a gaze so penetrating it made the monarch falter mid-step. There was something in that look, something that spoke of wounds deeper than any sword could inflict. "Because she owes me the life I never had." Chaol's words fell like stones into a silent well, and in that moment, Queen Isolde's legs gave out. She collapsed against the column, sliding down until she sat crumpled on the cold stone, her magnificent gown pooling around her like spilled wine. Her sobs now echoed across the courtyard, raw and uncontrolled, the kind of weeping that comes from a dam finally breaking after years of holding back an ocean. Princess Ilara rushed to her mother's side, but the queen pushed her away with surprising force, her eyes never leaving Chaol's face, studying it, memorizing it, searching it for something she had believed lost forever. And then, so quietly that only those nearest could hear, she whispered a single word that would shatter the foundations of the kingdom. "No." The forge fires of Dorne had burned every single day of Chaol's existence, their relentless heat shaping not just iron, but the very bones of the man he had become. He lived in a world of sparks and smoke, where the hammer's rhythmic song against steel was the only music he had ever known. The noblemen who came to collect their commissioned swords never looked at him, not really. Their eyes would slide past him as if he were merely another tool in the workshop, no more worthy of acknowledgement than the anvil or the bellows. He was 23 years old, though he couldn't be certain even of that, and every morning he woke with the same hollowness gnawing at his chest, a void that no amount of honest labor could fill. The medallion was his only inheritance, and he kept it hidden beneath his sweat-stained tunic, pressed against his heart like a secret that burned. The royal crest etched into the tarnished silver had haunted him since the old blacksmith first placed it in his palm on his 10th birthday, along with the terrible truth. Chaol had been found as an infant, wrapped in rags, left at the riverbank like refuse. The blacksmith, a man whose name Chaol never learned, who everyone simply called Old Iron, had carried him home that night and raised him without love but without cruelty either, teaching him that survival meant keeping your head down and your questions buried. But the medallion whispered different truths in the darkness. It spoke of blood that didn't match the soot beneath his fingernails, of a past that someone had desperately tried to erase. And beneath everything, festering like an infected wound, lived a resentment so deep it had become part of his breathing, the rage of a child who had been deemed unworthy of even a name. When news of the lion reached Dorne, carried by terrified farmers and merchants who barricaded themselves in their homes at dusk, Cale felt something shift inside his chest. The beast had torn through 3 villages in as many weeks, leaving behind scenes of carnage that made hardened soldiers weep. King Aldric's proclamation was posted in the town square, its parchment edges flapping in the wind like desperate wings. Whoever killed the monster would receive lands, gold, and Princess Alara's hand in marriage. Men gathered to read it, their eyes gleaming with greed or ambition, but Cale stood apart from them, feeling the medallion grow warm against his skin, as if responding to the king's words. This wasn't opportunity knocking. This was destiny screaming. Something primal stirred in his blood, a recognition he couldn't name. It was as if invisible threads had been pulling taut his entire life, and now they were finally drawing him toward their source. He couldn't explain to Old Iron why he was sharpening his blade at midnight, couldn't articulate why his hands moved with such certainty as he prepared for a confrontation that should have terrified him. The old man watched from the shadows, his weathered face unreadable, and when Cale finally met his gaze, Old Iron simply nodded, a gesture that somehow felt like both blessing and farewell. That night, sleep came like a fever dream. Cale found himself standing in a stone chamber bathed in moonlight, watching a woman he had never seen but somehow recognized with every fiber of his being. She stood over an ornate cradle, her body racked with sobs so violent they seemed to tear her apart from the inside. Her face was younger but unmistakable. High cheekbones, that particular curve of the jaw, eyes the color of emeralds even in the dream's muted palette. She reached into the cradle with trembling hands and lifted out a bundle wrapped in cloth bearing the royal crest, pressing it to her chest as if trying to absorb the child back into her body. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear but felt in his bones. "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." Then shadows moved at the chamber's edges, hands reaching in, pulling the bundle away as the woman's screams turned silent, her mouth open in a rictus of agony that produced no sound. The last thing Cale saw before waking was her collapsing to the floor, one hand outstretched toward the empty cradle, fingers clawing at stone as if trying to dig through reality itself. He woke with his face wet, salt stinging his eyes, and his heart hammering so violently he thought his ribs might crack. The medallion had left an imprint on his chest, the royal crest branded temporarily into his flesh. Old Iron stood in the doorway of his small room, holding a lantern, and for the first time in 13 years, Cale saw something like fear in the old man's eyes. "You saw her," Old Iron whispered, and it wasn't a question. Cale couldn't speak, could only nod as his throat closed around words that felt too large and terrible to voice. The blacksmith set down the lantern and sat heavily on the room's single stool, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. Then it's time. The river remembers what men choose to forget. At dawn, Cale walked into the forest with nothing but his sword, his medallion, and a certainty that felt like madness. The lion found him before he found it, or perhaps they found each other, drawn together by some cosmic arrangement that transcended mere chance. The battle was savage and brief, a blur of claws and steel and blood that painted the forest floor crimson. Cale fought not with the skill of a trained warrior, but with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. When the beast finally fell, its amber eyes dimming as life fled, Cale stood over it feeling none of the triumph he had imagined. Instead, there was only a profound emptiness, a sense that the lion's death was merely the first note in a symphony of revelation that would crescendo into something far more devastating. As he dragged the massive carcass toward Arvindal's gates, each step felt like walking toward an execution. His own or someone else's, he couldn't tell. The medallion burned against his chest, hot as the forge fires that had raised him, and with each labored breath, one thought echoed through his mind with the persistence of a funeral bell. This victory doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the truth. And so, when King Aldric offered him the princess, Cale understood with perfect, terrible clarity that the only prize that mattered was the one standing in shadow behind the throne. The woman from his dream, whose face he now recognized, whose tears he had felt in his sleep, whose abandoned child he had become. Queen Isolde had perfected the art of existing without truly living, a skill she had honed over 20 years of marriage to a man whose bed she shared, but whose heart she had never touched. She moved through the castle's gilded corridors like a ghost draped in silk and jewels, her beauty preserved but lifeless, like a flower pressed between the pages of a book no one bothered to read anymore. The servants whispered about her nightly walks through the garden, how she would drift among the roses long after midnight, her lips moving in silent conversation with shadows only she could see. Some claimed they had heard her weeping, soft and broken, the kind of crying that comes from a wound that never heals but only scabs over, waiting to be torn open again. What the servants didn't know, what no one knew except Isolde herself, was that she clutched a medallion during those midnight wanderings, its twin to the one the blacksmith's son wore against his chest. She would press it to her lips and whisper the name she had given her child in the 3 hours she had been allowed to hold him before they ripped him from her arms. Chaol. It meant warrior in the old tongue, a name she had chosen with a mother's desperate hope that strength might protect him wherever fate took him. For 2 decades, she had convinced herself he was dead, that the midwife's somber proclamation had been truth rather than the elaborate lie it was. She had built a tomb in her heart and visited it every night, laying flowers on a grave that held nothing but her own shattered dreams. Since the moment Chaol had spoken those impossible words in the throne room, Isolde had locked herself in her chambers, refusing food, refusing visitors, refusing even Princess Ilara's tearful pleas to explain what was happening. She sat by the window overlooking the courtyard where the blood-stained warrior had knelt, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to keep them still. Her mind kept replaying the scene, searching his face for the infant she had memorized in those stolen hours before dawn 23 years ago, the curve of his brow, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes held a darkness that spoke of abandonment and rage. Every feature was a mirror reflecting back the face of the knight she had loved. The father Chaol would never know, mixed with her own bloodline in a combination that was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. King Aldric's fury had transformed into something far more dangerous: suspicion. He summoned his advisors, his spies, his record keepers, demanding they unearth every fragment of information about the blacksmith's foundling son. The investigation yielded only fragments, whispers of a child discovered near the river 23 years prior, rumors that had circulated during the war about a noblewoman's bastard hidden away to avoid scandal, records that had been mysteriously destroyed or gone missing. But it was enough. The pieces formed a pattern that even the king, in his willful blindness, could no longer ignore. When the chief advisor presented his findings in the privacy of the king's study, his voice barely above a whisper, Aldric's face had gone through a spectrum of emotions: disbelief, rage, comprehension, and finally, something that looked disturbingly like betrayal. The king confronted Isolde that evening, bursting into her chambers with the report clutched in his fist like a weapon. "Tell me it's a lie," he demanded, his voice shaking with an emotion that went beyond anger into something more primal. "Tell me this peasant warrior is nothing to you, that his mad claim is the delusion of an ambitious fool." But Isolde couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around the truth she had swallowed for 2 decades, and when she tried to form words, only a strangled sound emerged. The king watched her face drain of color, watched her hands fly to her mouth, watched her entire body begin to shake as if an earthquake was tearing through her from the inside. "Burn it," she finally gasped, pointing at the report with a trembling finger. "Burn it all, please." But her plea only confirmed what Aldric had already begun to suspect, and the look he gave her before leaving was worse than hatred. It was the look of a man watching his entire world revealed as a carefully constructed fiction. That night, the king's guards came for Chaol. They dragged him from the small chamber where he had been kept under watch, not as honored guest but not quite prisoner either, and threw him into the dungeon's deepest cell. The stone walls wept with moisture and the air tasted of rot and despair. Chaol sat on the filthy floor, his back against the wall, and for the first time since killing the lion, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had set in motion. He had torn open a wound that had festered for decades, and the infection was spreading through the castle like plague. Part of him wondered if he should have simply taken the princess, accepted the lands and title, and buried the truth alongside his questions. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was impossible. Some truths demand to be spoken, regardless of the destruction they cause. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, too light to be a guard's heavy tread. Cale looked up to see a cloaked figure approaching, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to be seen. When the hood fell back, revealing Queen Isolda's tear-stained face illuminated by a single candle, Cale felt his breath catch. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, as if the weight of her secrets had been the only thing holding her upright, and now, exposed, she was collapsing inward. She approached the cell bars with shaking hands, and when she spoke, her voice was so fragile it seemed like it might shatter. "Where did you get it?" For a moment, Kyle didn't understand. Then he saw her eyes fixed on his chest, where the medallion hung visible through his torn shirt. He pulled it out, letting it catch the candlelight, and watched her face transform, watched 20 years of carefully maintained composure crack and fall away like a mask. Her hand shot through the bars, fingers grasping for the medallion with desperate hunger, and when Cale leaned forward to let her touch it, a sound escaped her throat that was barely human. It was recognition and grief and relief and horror all compressed into a single exhalation. "Where did you find this?" she repeated, her voice breaking on every word. Her fingers traced the royal crest with a tenderness that spoke of countless nights spent doing the same to its twin. Cale watched her face, memorizing every micro-expression, every flutter of emotion that crossed her features. "It was all they left with me," he said quietly. "The woman who abandoned me at the river. Old Iron said it was pinned to my blanket like someone wanted me to remember what I came from, even as they threw me away." The word abandoned hit Isolde like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, one hand clutching the bars to keep from falling, the other pressed to her chest as if trying to hold in her heart. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No, no, no." Tears streamed down her face, cutting tracks through powder and rouge, revealing the real woman beneath the Queen's carefully painted exterior. They said you were, I thought," but the words tangled in her throat, choking her, and all she could do was grip the bars and stare at Kyle with eyes that held the accumulated grief of 2 decades. Kyle rose and approached the bars, bringing his face close to hers. In the candlelight, the resemblance was unmistakable. The same high cheekbones, the same intense gaze, the same stubborn set of the jaw. "Who am I?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Tell me who I am." Isolde's lips trembled as she opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, heavy footsteps thundered down the corridor. King Aldric appeared, flanked by guards, his face a mask of cold fury. He took in the scene, his wife at the cell bars, the warrior inches from her face, the medallion glinting between them, and his expression hardened into something merciless. "Step away from the prisoner," he commanded, his voice like ice. When Isolde didn't move, he grabbed her arm and pulled her back with enough force to make her cry out. "What is the meaning of this?" Aldric's question was rhetorical, his eyes moving between his wife's devastated face and the medallion hanging from Kyle's neck. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, tension coiling tighter and tighter like a rope about to snap. Finally, Cale spoke, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It means, Your Majesty, that I am searching for the truth you have spent 23 years trying to hide." The king's face transformed, rage overtaking control. "Guards," he said, his voice deadly calm, "prepare the gallows. At dawn, this blasphemer hangs for treason against the crown." The past was a living thing in Isolde's memory. Clawing its way back through the years, with teeth and talons, she had thought long dulled by time. She had been 17 when she first saw him. The knight with eyes like storm clouds and a smile that made her forget she was merely a peasant girl scrubbing floors in the servants' quarters. His name was Sir Brennan, and he was everything the songs promised a hero would be. Brave, gentle, impossibly beautiful in the way young men are before war carves away their softness. Their love was the kind of secret that thrives in shadows, stolen moments in the stables, whispered promises in the kitchen garden after midnight. He would trace her face with calloused fingers and swear he would find a way for them to be together. that love could somehow transcend the canyon of class that separated a knight from a servant girl. Then the war came, as wars always do, sweeping through the kingdom like a fever. Sir Brennan rode out with King Aldric's forces, and Isolde watched from the castle walls, her hand pressed to her belly where their child grew in secret, a consequence of love they had been too young and desperate to prevent. She waited for his return with the kind of hope that is equal parts faith and delusion, but weeks became months, and the only news that came back was a blood-stained banner and a sergeant's grim report. Sir Brennan had died heroically, his body lost in a river swollen with spring rain and enemy dead. The knight who had promised her forever was gone, and Isolde was left with nothing but a swelling belly and terror so complete it paralyzed her. She hid the pregnancy for as long as possible, binding her stomach until she could barely breathe, but eventually the head housekeeper discovered her secret. Instead of casting her out as Isolde had expected, the woman, who had served the royal family for 40 years and knew where every skeleton was buried, made a calculated decision. King Aldric had recently lost his wife to fever, leaving him with an infant daughter and a kingdom that expected him to remarry quickly. The housekeeper saw an opportunity. A beautiful young woman of peasant stock, already pregnant, could be quietly elevated and presented as a suitable match. The child could be passed off as premature, born of a hasty wedding night, and no one would question it too closely. It was a transaction dressed up as mercy, and Isolde, desperate and alone, accepted her fate. The wedding was small and joyless, a formality that satisfied court protocol, but fooled no one with eyes to see. King Aldric took his new bride to his chambers with the mechanical efficiency of a man performing a duty rather than celebrating a union. He was not cruel, but neither was he kind. He was simply absent, his heart buried with the wife he had actually chosen. And Isolde, lying beside him in the vast royal bed, understood that she would spend her life as an ornament, a vessel, a placeholder for a love the king would never feel for her. The pregnancy progressed, and with each passing day, Isolde felt her child moving inside her, a constant reminder of Brennan and the love that had died on a battlefield she would never see. She talked to the baby in whispers, promised him, somehow she knew it was a boy, that she would protect him, that he would know love even if she had to give it all to him and keep none for herself. She chose the name KL in secret, writing it on scraps of parchment she burned immediately after, practicing how it would sound on her lips. The labor began 3 weeks early, on a night when thunder shook the castle foundations and rain hammered the windows like fists demanding entry. The pain was beyond anything Isolde had imagined, waves of agony that made her scream until her throat was raw. But when they finally placed the infant in her arms, still covered in blood and vernix, still wailing his fury at being thrust into the cold world, she felt something crack open inside her chest, a love so fierce and immediate, it was like being struck by lightning. She counted his fingers, traced the perfect shell of his ear, memorized the way his tiny hand wrapped around her thumb. For 3 hours, she held him, singing lullabies her own mother had sung, making promises she believed she would have a lifetime to keep. Then the royal advisor, a man named Corvain, whose loyalty was to crown and tradition above all human feeling, entered the birthing chamber with an expression that made Isolde's blood turn to ice. Behind him stood the midwife, her face carefully neutral, and 2 guards who wouldn't meet Isolde's eyes. Corvain approached the bed with measured steps, and when he spoke, his voice held the flat certainty of someone delivering an inevitable verdict. The child cannot stay. Isolde's arms tightened around Kale, whose crying had subsided into small hiccuping breaths. "What do you mean?" she demanded, though part of her already knew, already felt the trap closing around them both. "There are those who have counted the months, who whisper that this child came too quickly to be the king's blood," Corvain explained, his tone almost apologetic. To acknowledge him as heir would be to invite scandal, perhaps even civil war. The king's legitimacy, and therefore the kingdom's stability, rests on maintaining certain fictions. He gestured to the guards. "The child will be taken somewhere safe, somewhere far from court. You will recover from this difficult birth, and in time, you may bear the king true heirs. This is mercy, your majesty, though it may not feel like it now." Isolde screamed then, a sound that echoed through the castle corridors and made servants cross themselves in fear. She held Chael to her chest, her body curving around him protectively, but the guards were stronger and more numerous. They pried her fingers loose one by one while she begged, while she offered everything, her crown, her life, her soul, if they would just let her keep her child. The last thing she saw before they sedated her with drugged wine was Chael's face, red and scrunched and furious, his tiny mouth open in cries she could no longer hear as they carried him away into the rain-lashed night. When she woke, they told her the baby had died, that he had been too weak, too premature, that these things happened and she was young enough to try again. Isolde knew they were lying. A mother knows. But what could she do? She was a peasant girl wearing a crown she hadn't earned, married to a king she didn't love, trapped in a golden cage. So she swallowed the lie along with her grief, and over 20 years, it calcified inside her, becoming part of her skeleton, a framework of loss that held her upright even as it poisoned her from within. Now, standing in the dungeon corridor, with King Aldric's hand bruising her arm, watching Chael through the bars with his father's eyes and her own stubborn jaw, Isolde felt that calcified grief crack and crumble. Her legs gave out, and she would have fallen if the king hadn't been holding her. "My son," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "My son, my son, my son." Aldric released her as if she had burned him, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track: shock, betrayal, comprehension, and finally, a terrible cold fury. "What did you say?" His voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of an avalanche about to fall. Isolde looked up at him through tears, and for the first time in 20 years, she stopped performing the role of dutiful queen and became simply a woman who had lost everything and was now staring at the wreckage of what might have been. "He's mine," she said, her voice breaking but clear. "The child they told me died, the son I've mourned every day for 23 years. He's mine." The confession hung in the air like smoke, and in the cell, Chael gripped the bars with white-knuckled hands, his entire body trembling as decades of questions found their answer. The king looked between them, his wife, his prisoner, the truth that would destroy everything, and in that moment, his face became a mask of stone. "Guards," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "At first light, the traitor hangs, and you," he turned to Isolde, "will watch." The hours before dawn crawled by with the excruciating slowness of a dying man's final breaths, each minute stretching into an eternity of suffocating dread. Isolde paced her chambers like a caged animal, her silk slippers wearing paths into the Persian rugs, her mind racing through scenarios that all ended in the same nightmare, her son's body swinging from the gallows while she stood powerless to stop it. The weight of 23 years of silence pressed down on her chest until she could barely draw breath, and somewhere around midnight, something inside her snapped, not broke, but transformed, the way iron becomes steel in the forge's merciless heat. She had spent 2 decades being the king's ornamental wife, the silent keeper of secrets, the ghost who haunted her own life. That woman died in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and what rose in her place was a mother who would burn down kingdoms to save her child. She threw a cloak over her nightgown and moved through the castle's secret passages, corridors she had discovered during long nights of insomnia, routes used by servants and lovers conducting affairs away from prying eyes. Her destination was the advisor's quarters, where Corvain slept behind a heavy oak door reinforced with iron. She didn't knock. She simply opened the door, locked it behind her, and stood at the foot of his bed holding a candle in one hand and a letter opener in the other. The blade was small, decorative, meant for correspondence rather than violence, but the way she held it suggested she understood it could serve both purposes. Corvain woke to find his queen standing over him like an avenging angel, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes burning with an intensity that made him press back against his headboard. "Your Majesty," he stammered, reaching for the bell pull to summon guards, but Isolde's voice stopped him cold. "Ring that bell, and I swear on everything holy and unholy that I will tell the king you've been embezzling from the royal treasury for 15 years. I have the ledgers, Corvain." I've spent 20 years walking these halls invisible, and invisible people see everything. The bluff was magnificent because it wasn't entirely a bluff. She had discovered discrepancies in the accounts years ago and filed the information away, never knowing when it might prove useful. Corvain's hand froze halfway to the rope, and in that hesitation, Isolde saw her opening. "The child you stole from me," she said, her voice shaking but relentless. "The one you told me died. Where did you take him?" Corvain's face went through a remarkable transformation. Surprise, calculation, fear, and finally resignation. He was 73 years old, had served the crown since before Isolde was born, and he was tired. So tired of the secrets that multiplied like rats in the castle's walls, tired of being the kingdom's sin-eater, tired of carrying the weight of decisions made by desperate people in impossible situations. "To a blacksmith," he whispered finally. "A man named Old Iron who lived on the outskirts of Dorne. He was paid well to raise the boy and ask no questions. The medallion was my idea. I thought if the child ever sought his origins, he would at least have proof of his bloodline, even if no one would believe him." The confession spilled out of him like poison from a lanced wound, and with each word, Isolde felt her rage crystallize into something harder and more focused. "Write it down," she commanded, producing parchment and quill from the folds of her cloak. She had come prepared, had thought this through with the cold calculation of someone who had nothing left to lose. Every detail, the names, the dates, the reasons, sign it and seal it with your ring. Corvain's hands trembled as he wrote, his spidery script filling the page with truths that would shatter the kingdom's carefully maintained fiction. When he finished, Isolde snatched the document and pressed her own seal into the wax beside his, a queen's authority lending weight to a bureaucrat's confession. "If my son dies at dawn," she said softly, dangerously, "this document reaches every noble house in the kingdom by nightfall. Your legacy will be shame, Corvain. The man who stole a royal child and lied about his death. Think about that in whatever time you have left." But Corvain, perhaps sensing an opportunity for redemption or perhaps simply too old to care anymore about consequences, did something unexpected. He grabbed Isolde's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, and met her eyes with an expression that held genuine remorse. "There's more you need to know," he said urgently. "The king, he never knew the child lived. I acted alone, thinking I was protecting the crown. But there were others who knew, who helped. If you expose this, the scandal won't just touch me. It will burn through the court like wildfire." Isolde jerked her hand free, the letter opener suddenly feeling heavier in her palm. "Then let it burn," she said simply, and left the way she had come. But Corvain, terrified of exposure and desperate to maintain some control over the situation he had created, made his own decision. As soon as Isolde disappeared into the passage, he dressed hastily and slipped out of the castle through the servants' entrance. He went directly to the quarters of the king's most ambitious rival, a duke who had long coveted the throne, and in exchange for sanctuary, he told the man everything. About the bastard child, about the queen's deception, about the confession he had just signed. By the time the sun began to gray the eastern sky, rumors were already spreading through the castle like plague. The queen had cuckolded the king, the warrior in the dungeon was her illegitimate spawn. The entire royal line was built on lies. The town square filled with citizens as dawn broke, their faces eager with the terrible anticipation of public execution. The gallows stood like a skeletal finger pointing at the heavens, its noose swaying gently in the morning breeze. Chaol was brought out in chains, his face bruised from a night in the dungeon, but his eyes clear and unafraid. He had made peace with death somewhere in those dark hours, had accepted that truth sometimes demands the ultimate price. As the guards positioned him on the platform, he searched the crowd for one face, and when he found Isolde, standing apart from the nobles, wrapped in black like a widow at a funeral, their eyes met across the distance and held. The executioner approached with the rope, and the crowd's murmur rose to a roar of anticipation. Princess Alara suddenly burst from the castle doors, her dress torn from running, her hair disheveled, throwing herself at her father's feet. "Please," she sobbed, clinging to his legs like a child. "Please don't do this. If he speaks the truth, you're murdering your own." But King Aldrich cut her off with a gesture, his face carved from granite, unmoved by his daughter's tears or the whispers that had begun to circulate through his court. He watched as the noose was fitted around Cale's neck, as the young man straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin in a gesture of defiance that would have made any father proud. Just as the executioner reached for the lever that would drop the platform, a voice cut through the morning air with the force of a thunderclap. "Stop." Isolde emerged from the crowd, the confession clutched in her hands, held high above her head like a battle standard. She walked toward the gallows with the steady, inevitable pace of fate itself, and the crowd parted before her, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. Her black cloak billowed behind her, and in the dawn light she looked simultaneously ancient and newborn, a woman who had shed 23 years of silence and emerged transformed. She mounted the gallows steps, a queen ascending to her own execution, and faced the crowd with the document trembling in her hands. "This warrior is innocent," she declared, her voice carrying across the square with unexpected strength. "He seeks only the truth that was stolen from him. The truth that he carries royal blood. My blood." The gasps from the crowd were like a physical wave, but Isolde continued, turning now to face the king. "Read it," she commanded, holding out the confession. "Read what your trusted advisor has confessed. Read how my son, our son, in the eyes of the kingdom, was torn from my arms and left to die because powerful men feared scandal more than they valued human life." King Aldrich stood frozen, his hand halfway to his sword, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. The document was brought to him by shaking hands, and as he read Corvain's spidery script, as the truth seeped into his understanding like poison into water, his expression transformed from rage to something that looked almost like grief. He read about the deception, about the blacksmith, about the medallion that matched the one hanging from Cale's neck. He read about decisions made without his knowledge, about the child who should have been his stepson, raised as his heir, but instead had been discarded like refuse. The king looked up from the document, his eyes finding Cale's face, and for the first time, he truly saw the young man. Saw Isolde's features mixed with the Knight Sir Brennan's, saw the grandson of nobility and the great-grandson of kings, saw the son his wife had mourned for 2 decades. His hand fell away from his sword, and in that gesture the crowd understood that something fundamental had shifted in the kingdom's foundation. The ground beneath King Aldrich's feet seemed to shift and crack like ice on a thawing river, each revelation from Corvain's confession opening new fissures in the foundation of everything he had believed to be solid and true. The young man standing on the gallows platform, bruised, defiant, seconds from death, was not an ambitious peasant or a clever fraud. He was the son of the woman Aldrich had married out of duty, the child who should have been raised in the castle's nursery, taught to read and ride and rule, acknowledged as the queen's heir, even if he carried another man's blood. Instead, he had been thrown away like garbage, left to grow up in soot and obscurity, while Aldrich slept peacefully beside a wife who wept silent tears into her pillow every night for 23 years. The king's voice, when it finally emerged, was hollow and strange, like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. "Release him." The executioner hesitated, glancing between the king and the crowd, uncertain if he had heard correctly. "I said release him!" Aldrich's roar shattered the morning's tension, and suddenly everyone was moving. Guards rushing to remove the noose, courtiers whispering frantically, citizens pushing forward to get a better view of history unfolding. The king descended from his platform with unsteady steps, each movement seeming to cost him something essential, and when he reached the gallows, he looked up at Cale with an expression that held no anger, only a profound and terrible exhaustion. "Bring me Corvain," he commanded, his voice regaining some of its authority. "Bring me the man who thought himself wise enough to play God with my family." Within minutes, guards dragged the advisor before the crowd, his elderly frame shaking with fear as he realized the protection he had sought from the Duke would not save him from this public reckoning. The king held up the confession so everyone could see the seals, Corvain's ring and Isolde's royal stamp. "This man," Aldrich announced, his voice carrying across the square, "stole a child from his mother's arms, lied about his death, condemned an innocent to a life of poverty and obscurity to avoid scandal. He made decisions that were not his to make, and in doing so, he wounded this kingdom deeper than any enemy's sword ever could. The crowd's murmur grew into a roar of anger, and Corvain collapsed to his knees, understanding that he had become the sacrifice necessary to preserve the crown's dignity. But even as justice was declared and the advisor was led away to the very cell Chaol had occupied, the king felt something fundamental break inside himself. He had prided himself on being a fair ruler, a just king, a man who maintained order and stability in a chaotic world. Now he understood that his entire reign had been built on a lie he hadn't even known existed, and the realization was more devastating than any military defeat. He turned to Isolde, who stood beside Chaol now, her hand resting protectively on her son's arm, and saw in her eyes not love or even hatred, but a kind of distant pity that wounded him more deeply than contempt ever could. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question escaped before he could stop it, raw and childlike, the plea of a man who suddenly understood he had never truly known the woman who shared his bed. Isolde's laugh was bitter and broken, a sound like glass shattering in an empty room. "Tell you what, exactly? That they murdered our child. Yes, our child in the eyes of the kingdom, the boy who should have been your heir, while you slept? That every time you touched me, I wanted to scream because your hands reminded me of the guards who pried my son from my arms? That I have spent 23 years dying slowly in your golden cage, mourning a child I believed was dead while you went on living as if nothing had been lost?" Each word was a blade, and Aldrich felt them all land. "You never loved me," he whispered. And it wasn't an accusation but a statement of fact. He was only now able to speak aloud. "No," Isolde agreed quietly, with an honesty that was almost gentle in its finality. "I never did. But I tried to be what you needed, a proper queen, a suitable ornament, a woman who knew her place, and you never asked for more than that. So perhaps we gave each other exactly what we deserved, nothing." The silence that followed was absolute, the entire square holding its breath as witnesses to a marriage dissolving in real time. The king straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained its formal cadence, the mask of monarchy sliding back into place because it was the only face he knew how to wear. "Chaol," he said, addressing the young man directly for the first time, "I offer you title, lands, and a place at court. The rank of knight to begin, with elevation to come. It is inadequate recompense for what was stolen from you, but it is what I have the power to give." The offer hung in the air, generous by any measure, a chance for a blacksmith's apprentice to become nobility, to claim the birthright that should have been his from the start. But Chaol, still standing on the gallows platform, even though the noose had been removed, looked down at the king with an expression that held no gratitude, no eagerness, only a weary kind of clarity. "I don't want your titles," he said simply, his voice carrying across the square with quiet conviction. "I don't want your lands or your court or your attempts to purchase redemption for sins that aren't even yours to atone for." He touched the medallion at his chest, the twin to the one Isolde still wore hidden beneath her gown. "I wanted the truth, and now that I have it, I find it changes nothing. I'm still the child who was thrown away. A title won't erase that. Gold won't heal it. I am what I've always been. Unwanted." The word landed like a death knell, and Isolde's composure finally shattered completely. She climbed the gallows steps, her black cloak dragging behind her, and pulled Chaol into an embrace that 23 years of separation had made desperate and fierce. "No," she sobbed into his chest, her whole body shaking. "No, you were wanted. You were loved. I wanted you more than breath, more than my own life. They took you from me. They stole you." Her words dissolved into incoherent crying, and Chaol, this man who had killed a lion with his bare hands, who had faced death without flinching, wrapped his arms around his mother and wept. The crowd watched in silence as mother and son held each other on the gallows where one of them should have died, and more than one witness found tears streaming down their own face without quite understanding why. There was something primal and sacred in the scene, something that transcended politics and scandal, and spoke to the universal wound of separation and the impossible dream of return. Princess Alara, standing beside her father, felt something shift in her understanding of the world. She had spent her life viewing Chaol as a prize to be won, then a threat to be feared, and only now did she see him as simply human, damaged and brave and heartbreakingly real. When Isolde and Chaol finally separated, both their faces were wet and swollen. But something had eased in both of them, a tension released like a long-held breath, finally expelled. Chaol looked past his mother to the king and repeated his refusal, but with less edge this time. "I don't want your titles because they would make me part of the system that destroyed us. I don't want to be nobility. I want to be free of all of this, the lies, the pretense, the weight of crowns and names. I just want my name, the one my mother gave me before they took it away." Aldrich nodded slowly, and in that moment, he looked every one of his 57 years, shoulders bowed under the weight of a throne that suddenly seemed far heavier than gold. "Then you have it," he said quietly. "Chaol, son of Isolde, let it be recorded in the kingdom's archives that you are acknowledged and released from any obligation to the crown. You are free." The words should have felt like victory, but they tasted like ash in everyone's mouth. Chaol descended the gallows steps for the final time, Isolde beside him, and they walked together through the parting crowd toward the castle gates. The king watched them go, his hand rising as if to call them back, then falling helplessly to his side. At the gates, Chaol stopped and turned, his eyes finding the king one last time. "I don't forgive you," he said, not cruelly but simply stating fact. "But I don't blame you either. We're all just pieces in a game played by people who died long before we were born." Then he and Isolde passed through the gates, leaving the king standing alone in a square full of people who suddenly felt like strangers. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning's chill, word spread through the kingdom that the queen had left with the blacksmith's son, abandoning her crown and her title and her place in history. Some called it scandal. Others called it redemption. The king returned to his empty castle and ordered that a room in the highest tower be prepared, not for himself, but left vacant, a space held open for people who would never return. That night he sat alone in his chambers and wept for the first time since his first wife had died, mourning not what he had lost, but what he had never truly had. The road from Arvandal stretched before Chaol like an unwinding thread connecting past to future, each step taking him further from the castle's spires and deeper into the familiar poverty of the countryside where he had always belonged. Isolde walked beside him for the first 3 days, her royal gowns traded for simple homespun, her jeweled coronet replaced by a plain woolen scarf that hid hair she had cut short with kitchen shears in a gesture of mourning or liberation. Even she couldn't say which. They spoke little during those days, both too raw from the violence of truth finally spoken, but their silence was companionable rather than strained. The quiet of two people who had found each other after being lost for so long that words felt inadequate to bridge the gap. On the 4th day, they reached the outskirts of Dorne, where the blacksmith's forge still stood like a monument to the life Chaol had lived before everything changed. The building looked smaller than he remembered, its walls more weathered, the forge cold and dark because old iron had died 3 weeks earlier. Peacefully in his sleep, the neighbor said, though Chaol suspected the old man had simply decided he had lived long enough and willed his heart to stop beating. They found him buried in the small cemetery behind the village church, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross that bore no name, just as he had requested. Chaol stood over the mound of earth and felt the weight of orphanhood settle over him again. But different this time, not the abandonment of infancy, but the natural grief of losing the only father he had truly known. That evening, sitting in the forge's dying warmth with Isolde, Chaol told her about the last conversation he'd had with Old Iron before riding out to hunt the lion. The old blacksmith had been unusually talkative that night, his tongue loosened by ale and the premonition of endings. He had spoken of things he'd witnessed decades ago, terrible things that happened during the war when King Aldrich was consolidating power. "The lion," Old Iron had said, his words slurred but his eyes sharp, "wasn't always a beast of the forest. 20-some years back, when you were just born, there was a village that refused to pay taxes, said the king's claim to the throne wasn't legitimate after the previous king died without clear succession. Aldrich needed to make an example, but he was clever about it. Didn't want to be seen as a tyrant who massacred his own people. The old man had leaned closer, his breath smelling of cheap wine and secrets. So he brought in lions, captured from the southern territories where they still roam wild, released them near the rebellious villages during the night. When dawn came and the bodies were found, torn apart and half-eaten, well, who could blame the king for a tragedy of nature? Old Iron had laughed, a bitter sound without humor. The beasts were supposed to be hunted down after, but one was smart, escaped into the deep forest and lived there for 2 decades, growing old and crafty. The lion you killed, that was the last witness to Aldrich's original sin, the living proof of how he secured his throne through deception, dressed up as misfortune. Kyle had thought the old man was rambling, his mind deteriorating in those final days, but now, sitting in the forge with his mother, the pieces assembled themselves into a pattern that made terrible sense. "That's why I had to kill it," he said quietly, watching Isolde's face in the firelight. "Not for glory or reward, but because some part of me understood that the lion was a symbol. The king's power built on lies and buried bodies, on violence disguised as natural disaster. Killing it wasn't heroism, it was bearing witness, making visible what had been hidden for generations." Isolde listened with her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes reflecting the horror of understanding how deep the corruption ran. How many lives had been twisted or destroyed by decisions made in throne rooms by men who never had to face the consequences of their choices? "And now?" she asked. "Now that you've killed the symbol, exposed the truth, claimed your name, what do you do with this freedom you've won?" It was the question Kale had been avoiding since leaving the castle, the terrifying blank space that opened up when you finally got what you thought you wanted and discovered it didn't fill the void you'd expected it to. He looked around the forge, at the tools Old Iron had taught him to use, at the half-finished blade still sitting on the anvil, and felt the pull of the familiar. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought finding my mother would make me whole, but I'm still just pieces pretending to be a person. The angry child, the grieving son, the warrior who killed for the wrong reasons. They don't fit together into anything coherent." Isolde reached across the space between them and took his scarred hands in her soft ones, and the contrast spoke volumes about the different lives they had lived in parallel. "Maybe wholeness is a lie we tell ourselves," she said gently. "Maybe we're all just pieces, and the best we can do is find other pieces that don't cut us when we brush against them." They stayed in Dorne for 2 more weeks, during which Isolde helped Kale sort through Old Iron's possessions, which were few, and spoke of a life lived simply and without attachment. They found letters, unposted, that the blacksmith had written to the castle over the years, documenting Kyle's growth, his first words, his aptitude for metalwork, his questions about where he came from. Old Iron had been reporting to someone, keeping a record, and the letters were addressed not to Corvain, but to Queen Isolde herself, though they had never been sent. "He wanted you to know," Kale said, holding the stack of parchment that represented 23 years of his life reduced to quarterly updates. "He wanted you to know I was alive, that I was growing up, that someone was watching over me. But he never had the courage to send them." Isolde wept over the letters, reading each one multiple times, learning about the son she had missed raising through the careful, unpracticed handwriting of an old man who had tried, in his limited way, to do right by a child he had never asked for. When she finished reading, she carefully packed them in her traveling bag, these scraps of paper now among her most precious possessions. "I'll keep them," she said, "so that when I'm old and my memory fails, I'll have proof that you existed, that you were real, that this wasn't all just a beautiful, terrible dream." Eventually, the time came for separation. Isolde had decided to return to her family's original village, where her parents had died years ago, but where she still had cousins who might remember her. She would live quietly, she said, helping with harvests and caring for children, and trying to remember what it felt like to be just a woman, rather than a symbol draped in silk and regret. Kale walked her to the crossroads where their paths would diverge, and they stood facing each other, both understanding that this goodbye might be permanent, that the world had a way of keeping people apart even when they desperately wanted to stay together. "Will you be all right?" Isolde asked, smoothing his hair back from his forehead in a gesture so maternal it made his throat close up. Kale nodded, not trusting his voice, and pulled the medallion from his neck. He held it out to her, but she shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "Or don't. Bury it, throw it in the river, melt it down and forge it into something useful. You've carried it long enough. Let it go." Instead, Chaol took his small knife and carefully pried the medallion open. It was designed to split, though he'd never known until that moment. He gave half to Isolde and kept half for himself, the royal crest now divided between them, incomplete and honest in its brokenness. As Isolde disappeared down the eastern road, growing smaller until she was just a speck that might have been a person, or might have been a bird, or might have been nothing at all, Chaol returned to the forge one last time. He stoked the fire to life and took out the unfinished blade, Old Iron's final project. He worked it methodically, hammer ringing against steel, the familiar rhythm centering him in a way nothing else could. When he finished, hours later with the sun setting behind the hills, he had a sword that was plain and functional, bearing no decoration or maker's mark. He walked to Old Iron's grave and thrust the blade into the earth at the head of the mound, a marker that would rust and fade, but would stand longer than wood. On the grave, he placed his half of the medallion, pressing it into the soil so it was half buried, half visible, neither fully hidden nor fully revealed, like truth itself. "Thank you," he said to the old man who couldn't hear him, to the mother who was already miles away, to whatever gods or fates or cosmic indifferences had brought him to this moment. Then he turned and walked away from Dorne, from Arvindal, from the only life he had ever known, toward a horizon that held no promises, but at least held possibility. Years later, travelers passing through Dorne would notice the sword at the blacksmith's grave and the strange half-coin pressed into the earth beside it. Some said it was a memorial to a great warrior. Others claimed it marked the resting place of a man who had kept a royal secret. The truth, as always, was more complicated and more simple than any legend could capture. It was just a son saying goodbye to a father who had tried his best with limited resources, and a man leaving behind the symbols that had defined him so he could discover who he might be without them. Time moved differently after the truth was spoken, no longer measured in days and years, but in the quiet accumulation of small redemptions that rebuilt what scandal had torn down. King Aldric ruled for 7 more years after Chaol's departure, and those who served him noticed a profound change in the man who wore the crown. The harsh edge of his authority softened into something that looked almost like wisdom, and he began to govern not with the iron certainty of a king who believed himself infallible, but with the tentative humility of a man who had discovered how little he truly understood. He established laws protecting the rights of illegitimate children, created sanctuaries for unwed mothers, and personally oversaw the dismantling of the advisor system that had allowed men like Corvain to make life-altering decisions in shadows. Some called it penance. Others called it the delayed awakening of a conscience. Whatever it was, it transformed Arvindal from a kingdom built on rigid hierarchy into something more flexible, more forgiving, more human. Princess Elara ascended to the throne when her father died quietly in his sleep, his last words a whispered apology to a wife who was no longer there to hear it. She was 28 years old, unmarried by choice, and she ruled with a combination of her father's strategic mind and a compassion he had only learned too late. One of her first acts as queen was to commission a monument in the castle's main courtyard, not a statue of a king or a celebration of military victory, but a simple stone marker that bore an inscription in plain language anyone could read. To those whose stories were silenced, whose names were erased, whose lives were deemed inconvenient to power, may we remember that every crown rests on the shoulders of the forgotten. The monument caused controversy among the nobility, who felt it was undignified to acknowledge past wrongs so publicly, but the common people loved it. They would bring flowers and leave them at the base of the stone, and mothers would bring their children there to teach them that power without accountability was tyranny, no matter how benevolent its face. Elara also did something that shocked the court. She tracked down every document related to Chaol's story, Corvain's confession, the blacksmith's unsent letters, the birth records that had been falsified, and had them bound into a book that she kept in the royal library, available for any citizen to read. History, she declared when the court objected, belongs to everyone, not just to those who look good in its telling. In the eastern provinces, in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps, Isolde lived the last 15 years of her life as she had begun it, as a peasant woman whose hands knew the feel of soil and bread dough and the rough wool of homespun cloth. Her cousins welcomed her back with the careful kindness reserved for family members who have experienced tragedies too large to speak of directly, and they never asked her about the years she had spent as queen. She worked in the fields during harvest, helped birth babies when the midwife was overwhelmed, and taught the village children their letters using a patience that seemed to come from some deep, previously untapped well within her. At night, she would sit by her small fire and read through old Iron's letters, tracing the chronicle of her son's childhood with fingers that had grown rough and capable again. She never remarried, never sought position or comfort beyond what her labor could earn, and when people asked why a woman still beautiful enough to attract suitors chose solitude instead, she would smile in a way that suggested she knew secrets they couldn't begin to imagine. "I had my great love," she would say simply. "Most people never get even that much." She was speaking of Sir Brennan, of course, but also of something else, the fierce, consuming love a mother feels for a child, a love that had survived separation and grief and 23 years of manufactured death. That love sustained her through the quiet years, warming her more surely than any hearth fire. When she died at 62, weakened by a winter fever that her aging body couldn't fight, she was surrounded by the village children she had taught, who held her hands and sang the lullabies she had taught them, the same songs she had once sung to Cale in the 3 hours she'd been allowed to hold him. Her last words were addressed to someone none of them could see. "I kept my promise. I never forgot." They buried her in the village cemetery under an apple tree that bloomed white in spring, and on her grave they placed the half-medallion she had carried with her always, pressed into the earth so it caught the sunlight and threw it back in fractured rainbows. The stories spread, as stories do, carried by merchants and travelers and minstrels who understood that people hunger for tales that contain both tragedy and hope. The legend of the warrior who refused a princess and asked for a queen became a cautionary tale about the cost of secrets, a romance about love transcending death, a political parable about powers corrupting influence. Bards sang different versions in different kingdoms, each one emphasizing whatever moral lesson their audience most needed to hear. But the core remained constant. A son sought his mother, a truth was spoken at great cost, and somehow, despite everything, redemption was possible even for the most broken among us. In a village 3 weeks' journey west of Arvindal, in a region so remote that royal proclamations arrived months late and wars felt like distant rumors, there lived a blacksmith who taught the local children not just how to work metal, but how to think about the world. He was quiet and kept to himself mostly, though the villagers respected him for the quality of his work and the gentle way he corrected their children's mistakes. He never married, never claimed any grand history, and when people asked where he came from, he would say simply, "From the forge," which was true enough to satisfy curiosity without inviting deeper questions. The children loved him because he told stories while he worked, not fairy tales about princes and dragons, but stories about real people who faced impossible choices and somehow found the courage to do what was right, even when right meant losing everything. He spoke about forgiveness not as weakness, but as the hardest form of strength, about the difference between justice and revenge, about how sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone go. The children didn't always understand the lessons embedded in his stories, but they felt the truth in them, the weight of lived experience rather than abstract moralizing. On his chest, barely visible beneath his leather work apron, hung half of a medallion on a leather cord worn soft with years of friction against skin. He never explained its significance, and no one asked, respecting the privacy of a man who clearly carried ghosts he preferred not to name. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the forge fire burned low and the stars emerged like punctuation marks in a story only the universe could read, he would take out the medallion and hold it to the light, remembering a mother's face, a king's broken pride, a gallows he should have died on, a choice to walk away from everything a crown could offer. The blacksmith grew old gracefully, his hair turning silver, his shoulders developing the permanent curve of a man who had spent decades bent over an anvil. The children he taught grew up and brought their own children to learn from him, creating a lineage of knowledge that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the patient transmission of craft and wisdom from one generation to the next. He never claimed to be anyone special, never spoke of royal blood or lions killed or truth that had shattered kingdoms. He was just a blacksmith who made good tools and told good stories and lived a good life, which, he had discovered, was more than enough. When he died at 71, peacefully in his sleep after a long day's work, the village mourned him with a sincerity that would have made any king envious. They buried him in the cemetery on the hill, and on his grave they placed the tools of his trade, hammer, tongs, and a small anvil, creating a monument to honest labor. Among the tools, someone placed the half-medallion that had been found in his workshop, its royal crest meaningless to the villagers but beautiful in the way broken things can be when they've been carried with love. And there it stayed, slowly being covered by earth and grass, until it was no longer visible but remained present nonetheless. A secret the ground kept for a man who had learned that some truths are best left buried while others demand to be spoken, and wisdom lies in knowing which is which. The kingdom that had been born from lies and cemented with silence slowly transformed into something more honest, more merciful, more willing to acknowledge its own capacity for error. And in a small way, in the space between what was said and what remained silent, between the crown that was refused and the life that was chosen, redemption happened not through grand gestures, but through the quiet accumulation of days lived with integrity. The greatest lesson, the one that survived all the retellings and embellishments, was simple and profound. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say no to what the world calls glory, and yes to what your heart knows is true. Even when, especially when, that truth cost you everything.